Hello, this is Dr. Oscar Hernandez, board-certified internist and pediatrician. We're doing another installment today of the commonly asked questions that I get online and from our patients in the office. And today we're going to deal a little bit with the issue of vaccines. And then I want to talk about the issue of certain blood pressure medicines that we often use that initially started to get a bad name when it came to COVID-19. And I was one of the early people who said there's very little evidence of that. And now there's mounting evidence that there's no problem between these certain antihypertensives and the COVID-19 infection. We're going to talk about that in detail in a little while. But first, we're going to touch base about the question that so many people ask me. When are we getting a shot? Don't hold your breath. It's not coming right away. Here's the thing. There's over 20 different vaccines or manufacturers that are in the process of trying to develop a vaccine. We'll see who gets first to market. There are different ways of producing a vaccine against COVID-19. The efficacy of one method or another is still uncertain. We still don't know this. But the biggest efforts have to do with developing vaccines that are based on what we call mRNA, messenger ribonucleic acid. And the idea is that if we present to the body these messenger RNAs that are similar to those of COVID-19, that we will develop immunity. Remember, COVID-19 is a virus. It requires our cellular apparatus and it takes over our ability to produce our own messenger RNA in cells so that the COVID-19 virus will produce its own proteins and rebuild and duplicate itself. So that's where the money is at this time. There has been development by some of the big manufacturers, Glaxo, Sanofi Pasteur, Takeda. These are not household names, but they're household names in the medical community. And then there are other manufacturers that are also entering the fray. Mesoblast in April with National Institutes of Health support started doing what we call phase 1 clinical trials. There's another company called Moderna, which in March also started its own clinical trials, but those are phase 1 studies. Then there's Inovio, Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson secured a $5 million partnership with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for its efforts. Their trials begin in September. They're a little late to the starting game. All said and done, I think we're not going to see anything in terms of a vaccine for a good year or so. But remember from a prior video, we have some encouraging reports about remdesivir, and we reviewed a trial that was just very recently published on April 19th in the New England Journal of Medicine. If you didn't catch that video, look it up because it really is encouraging information. So here's the skinny. Don't hold your breath for a vaccine. We still need to go back to the basics. As I've mentioned over and over and over on these videos, you can wrap your head around all kinds of stuff that's on the web, but hey, personal hygiene, proper coughing and sneezing techniques into the antecubital fossa, the hand sanitation, the social distancing. That doesn't mean isolation, that's social distancing, because we as human beings need to have social contact with other people. So that's very important. I now want to jump tracks a little bit and talk a little bit more about the issue of hypertension and COVID-19. We know, because we've been studying those people who do die, unfortunately, with COVID-19, we know that many of them have hypertension. And so there's a question, is hypertension a predisposing factor to death in COVID-19 infections? And here's the thing, the people who tend to get very sick and die, and there's unfortunately people of all ages. We have seen deaths in children, deaths in young people, deaths in infants, deaths in people of all ages. But the predominant group that tends to have terrible results and eventually death with COVID-19 are older patients, sicker patients, people who have diabetes, hypertension, who are immunosuppressed, and so on. Well, this older group of people has a higher incidence of hypertension. And one of the main drugs that is used throughout the world for the treatment of hypertension is what we call ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers. These are two different classes of medicines, but they act very similarly to bring down blood pressure. And so, because they're very often used, we may see more people dying on these medications, but I don't think that it's because these medications predispose patients to death. There is a molecular reason as well to conceptualize the idea that these drugs further increase replication of the virus in patients. And that's because ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers are known to have an effect on the receptors on the cell, especially receptors on the cells in lungs that respond to these blockers and upregulate what is called the ACE2 receptor in some of these tissues. And these are the receptors that are used by the virus in part to get into the cell and to take over that protein reproducing apparatus that we previously mentioned when we discussed vaccines. So there's a theoretical idea, there's an actual statistical prevalence of patients who are on these medications, but again, we don't think it's because the medications predispose you to having worse COVID outcomes, but because rather these are generally sicker patients that we see having bad results, and many of these patients have the comorbidity of hypertension. Now, let me give you an example of jumping the gate and coming to conclusions that we really shouldn't be coming to. And I caution in my videos over and over about over-conceptualizing and hypothesizing things, and then we get paralyzed with hearsay data, and we don't really act on the basics that we should be doing to protect ourselves from COVID-19. So about 3 weeks ago, I received a text from one of the other physicians or nurse practitioners in our group talking about a recommendation that had come out of Yale University concerning the use of these types of medicines. Let me read you the brief excerpt. And these were the recommendations at the time from this particular chief at Yale. It says, patients with hypertension, diabetes, kidney disease, coronary artery disease, or heart failure with preserved ejection fraction receiving an ACE or an ARB, these angiotensin converting enzyme or receptor blockers, should have it stopped at the time COVID-19 is suspected. It also goes on to make other recommendations of pretty much a lot of people getting their ACEs and ARBs stopped. Let me tell you, these are very important medications in the management of congestive heart failure, in protecting kidneys, and so on. Since then, we've had a number of professional organizations come out with recommendations about the uses of ACEs and ARBs. None of them are requesting or recommending that we stop these medications in patients whether or not they have COVID-19 infection. So let me rattle out a list of some of those professional organizations because it's really very impressive, and it's a great example of how we anticipate and jump the gun making recommendations without any data, only to have to take back those recommendations as more data comes out. So here we go. Here's the list. I'm going to read it because I don't want to have a misstep here and say something that isn't true. All of these recommendations were updated in March of 2020. In other words, about 4 or 5 weeks ago from the time when this video was being recorded. The European Society for Hypertension recommends continuing ACEs and ARBs due to lack of evidence to support differential use in COVID-19 patients. That means there's no evidence that these medicines are bad in COVID-19 patients. This is the same type of recommendation that comes out of the European Society of Cardiology, the Hypertension Society of Canada, Canadian Cardiovascular Society, the Renal Association of the United Kingdom, the International Society for Hypertension, the American College of Physicians, that's us, the USA, the Spanish Society of Hypertension, the American Heart Association, the European Renal Association, American Society of Pediatric Nephrology, and the High Blood Pressure Research Council of Australia. There are more on the list, but the point is this. If you're on an ACE, if you're on an ARB, before you go running to your doctor saying that you need to stop your medicine, or worse yet, stopping it on your own, rethink it. This is basically hearsay, no data behind it. Folks, stick to your ACEs and ARBs. No evidence that it would make a COVID-19 infection worse. No evidence that if you're infected with COVID-19, you're going to be any worse off because you use these types of medicines or wind up having the final result, which would be to lose your life. Hopefully, that's not going to happen. And if it does, it's not going to be because of these medicines. Anyway, that's the latest, of course. As things develop and things go on, we bring you the update. So we've talked a little bit about ACEs, ARBs, vaccines, and that's just a small update. Remember the basics. We always pounce on the basics. It's important to keep the hygiene up, the proper social distancing, not necessarily isolation, but distancing. Remember, if you like these videos, subscribe so that we can keep you informed as we develop new ones. Give us a thumbs up if you like us, and you can also follow us on Facebook, Oscar Hernandez _MD. I want to leave you, as always, with a word of encouragement. Again, if you're a person of faith, hang on to your faith. It'll help you make it through the night. If you're not a person of faith, get in touch with the inner faith, because almost all of us have a measure of faith. The scripture that I want to reflect on today comes out of Joshua. Now, for those of you who don't know, the story of the people of Israel is that Moses leads them out of slavery, out of Egypt, and into the promised land, the land of Canaan. But Moses never gets to go in and lead the people. He dies, and Joshua is his successor. Now, Joshua had been a man of battle, and he was going to engage in a lot more battles as he goes into the land of Canaan and conquers these city-states as the Israeli people start to possess the land. But he was afraid. He had a daunting task before him, and he was going to be faced with many, many enemies. Remember, for many people, this virus is like a daunting enemy, like a daunting task that is before us. But don't be overwhelmed. This is what God says to Joshua. He says, "This is my command." It's not God's suggestion. It's not God's idea. It's a command. He was giving this to Joshua, and by extension, we can seize on that command and incorporate it. And says, "This is my command. Be strong and courageous." Courageous doesn't mean that you don't have fear in the face of a challenge, but courageous means that you are going to stand up in the face of that fear, overcome it, and do what has to be done. Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. That's a tall order for a man who is going to face devastating armies ahead of him. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. He was going to go into a land of many enemies. A lot of us are facing enemies, financial enemies, family troubles, sickness, illness, disease, whether it's from COVID-19 or something else. If you're a person of faith, seize on this wisdom that was written so many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And if you're not, seize on the opportunity to develop your faith, because almost everybody has a measure of faith.